Yeah.
Video good over there?
All good?
All right, nice. We can probably get a slow start. I don't think. Yeah, let's just do that. So, okay, so it's Friday, and thank you for that. Yeah. So it's Friday, and I've already lost track of what I'm doing. So, I'm Seth Lindberg. I'm one of the coordinators for the Symposium here. I do some writing on the side, and I'm passionate about a couple of things. One of them is a topic that we should be here today. So it's Friday at 2 o'clock, in case you start to forget that. Most of us have this issue in GenCon that you start to lose track of time and space. So we're here to talk about something that really overlaps our symposium with the rest of GenCon, which is gamifying stories or storifying games. So it makes a lot of sense. So we're going to talk about how to translate one medium to the other. And so the way this is going to go down is we'll start off with some introductions, and I'll let the panelists actually introduce themselves. Then I'll lead some questions for roughly half hour-ish, and then we'll kind of bleed that into questions from the crowd. We'll try to reserve about 5 minutes for some final comments, and somewhere between 5 to 10 till we're supposed to stop. And so we'll kind of see if someone tries to ram the gates or whatnot. But I'll monitor the time, and I think it'll go pretty smoothly. So we know why we're here. And so let's do some introductions, and I think we'll just start off at the opposite end first. So Lucien, can you give it a whirl? Explain who you are a bit and why you might be here.
All right, hi there. My name is Lucien Soulban. I got my start in tabletop games, and I transitioned over doing some tie-in fiction. The majority of my work now is in video games. I was lead writer on video games like Far Cry 3, Far Cry 4, Far Cry Blood Dragon, Warhammer 40K, Dawn of War, and I am currently at Watchdogs 2. I'm currently narrative director over at 2 Games, which is a division of Wizards of the Coast.
Awesome. Jennifer?
I'm Jennifer Brozek. I'm a full-time author, editor, and media tie-in writer for games. I started working in QA at Sega of America in 1993.
Sweet.
I have worked in games full-time since 2004. I've written for Margaret Weiss Productions, Colonial Gothic, making the games. Now, there's a lot more, but I don't remember them all. Now I write fiction for Shadowrun, BattleTech. I've written for Masters of Orion, V-Wars, Predator. I've written on a AAA MMO called Ion, and I wrote on, 20 years later, I got to continue the Samuel Verne story, and I wrote on Shadowrun Returns. These days, I'm mostly BattleTech and Shadowrun. I have another possible IP coming up, so I've worked on a lot. I've also podcasted Shadowrun.
Hi, I am Matt John, and I started working for Monolith Games, which publish Conan the Board Game, Batman Gotham City Chronicles, and I do a lot of the flavor text stuff. I do some rule stuff. I worked on the Conan role-playing game by Modiphius. And I've also been working on the Terminator role-playing game by Nightfall, which is coming out soon. So I got to get my hands in the pies of all of these properties I absolutely adored as a child. Oh, and I also host a podcast called Rogues in the House, which is dedicated to sword and sorcery, and it's pretty funny. So I recommend checking that out.
Well, man, my credentials aren't going to sound like anything now.
Thanks, guys.
My name is Byron Leavitt. I work for Dimension Games. We make games like Deep Madness, Dawn of Madness, which is a story-driven game, as well as Twisted Fables. Then do some of my own writing and stuff like that too. So, yeah.
Awesome. Okay, so the first lead-in I have to this, it'll be a slight preamble, but I really got into the Fighting Fantasy game books in the early 1990s, which actually, by Ian Williamson and Steve Jackson, those actually were the precursor for the Warhammer books, and the Games Workshop came out of all of those books that, you know, they're basically choose your adventure books where you get to roll dice for your characters and stuff. And they're pretty dark, which is really nice as well. So there's an interesting tidbit about that. Not only is that a game book, so it's in between games and books, they had behind the scenes a slight, I don't know, mini controversy. So the first book cover that came out featured, I don't know, it was just some, you know, dude with a sword with a, you know, some monsters surrounded for a Warlock on Firetop Mountain. And Ian Livingston and Steve Jackson actually were pissed because they didn't want a person focused on the cover. They wanted the reader to be immersed in the book, and whoever was in charge of the art didn't know that or something. But they put the first printing had a hero as if that was already kind of predefined for the reader, and so there was a little debate on like, hey, for when you're you know, like when you're doing a role-playing game, should you be taking on a different persona or not? And like in a video game, or is it you, or are you taking on the role of someone else? Anyway, that was the first thing I thought of. I think that there's a bunch of other questions, but I wanted to lead off with this idea on your guys' thoughts on for fiction that spans the board game to a book. You know, how much should it reflect the reader, or let the player become the character? Is that too deep to start off with? You're like, dude, what are you doing? Yeah. Jennifer, you got this.
So I don't do board games to novels. I do role-playing games. And in role-playing games, you go, for me, I try to keep as close to the rule set as possible. So I work with the line developers because I don't want my characters doing something cool in the book that the reader cannot do in the role-playing game. Because people get mad about that, and then they yell at you, the author. And at this point, I have to be very careful because BattleTech has 40 years of IP behind it, and Shadowrun is almost there. So there's 3 or 4 levels of fact check through the company. But what I like to do is tell a story that anybody else can relate with, especially if they don't necessarily know the IP. But if you do know the IP, I put specific things in there that the OG players love. So it's different.
Yeah. What about video games? Do you
video games.
Yeah.
So it's video games. When I was hired by Harebrained Schemes, part of my interview was to write the opening load screen of Shadowrun Returns without knowing anything about the plot line in second person without telling the player what they're feeling. That was part of my interview. I made sure I got paid for that. So you're never supposed to tell the player what they feel. You're supposed to tell the player a specific tone. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it actually, it also depends. We have a lot of discussions. If we're doing a first-person game in video games, we oftentimes say, okay, you're in the head of the player, therefore we kind of want the player themselves to put their own personality into that. But one of the reasons why is because you don't see much body language, and you can't communicate much body language because you never see your body, you just see your arms in the game, or your feet. When it comes to other games, when it usually is like third person, over the shoulder, whatever it is, it's easier to put in personalities because we don't have to worry about bringing the camera out for cutscenes. We can put in a specific personality, but there's always a concern, as you mentioned before, we don't want the player feeling like they have to do something. So for example, on Watchdogs 2, we tried to march that line between the fact that it was an open world game and you could go around with a billiard ball on a string and whack anybody you met out in the real world and still have a character who is loved and liked by the audience. And there's that little bit of that disconnect that sometimes you have to rely on.
The example is you can't say someone trembled from the cold. You can say a cold pervasive air slicks against your body. You basically don't tell the player how they're feeling about the cold, but you let them imagine it. And you use words like moist. Immediate reaction. You have to be very good with your descriptions to evoke emotions and reactions without saying you feel?
Moist evokes different reactions for me.
Depends on context.
Well, for Conan, I think, I guess, like the board game, I guess in a sense you want people to be Conan, but you also want to have some flexibility about what they do, right?
Yeah, so Conan's interesting because you've got most players want to be Conan, or they want to get that vibe and to have that sense of power. Conan's a bit of a power fantasy. And the trick is it's a multiplayer game with more people at the table, so you got to make sure that other characters from that mythos are introduced as well. So, and of course I've written on the board game and the role-playing game, which, as we've said, they're different beasts. And so I think the word tone is something that I come back to over and over again, because you can adapt these stories, but you can't write the outcomes. So it becomes a matter of the tone needs to be there, it needs to feel correct, and I mean I could bring this into how important the mechanics are as well. So if you're adapting a sword and sorcery tale, it needs to be fast moving. Forward momentum. And if you've got a super crunchy system or charts and tables and you have to consistently look at a rule book, all of that power fantasy has dissolved. So for me, tone or feel are incredibly important.
So I think the projects I'm working on are probably significantly different than what a lot of people here are doing. There's like our game Dawn of Madness is very story driven. It's almost has choose your own adventure kind of vibes. You're working through one person's basically mental trauma and that sort of thing. So you know roughly who the character is. I always write it in second person though, so it is like it's you experiencing it. You're walking through this world and you're experiencing it. And like Jennifer was saying, there's a lot of descriptive words. You need to be very careful with your descriptions of different things, and you can evoke, in my case, I'm trying to scare people, so you can evoke a lot of feelings just by describing in detail the world around the players and what they're going through. And then, of course, they're participating in the story too. So the actions that they're taking, maybe they're rolling dice, maybe maybe it's as simple as a choice. Maybe they can't do something because their character is nerfed in a certain way. So it's just, well, in my case, it's almost always a bad things because, like I said, it's a horror game. But there's a lot of it's giving them the agency and making them feel like they're there, like they're present. And in my case, I can kind of make feelings of fear and feelings of disquiet and dread and that sort of thing, and impose that on the players like they're there and they're present. So yeah, it's a lot of fun. Everyone should try it.
So this has been a writers' conference. I suppose there's a lot of us out there who actually have a fiction or some board game-like thing, or maybe just an RPG that they want to translate into the other one. I'd like to discuss the craft or strategies around that. I think Jennifer started to touch on this a little bit, I guess. So like if you're given a new project and you're tasked with translating, I guess let's pick one to be more specific first. I guess let's say you have the story already and you want to gamify it. It's broad, but you guys can take it where you want to go. You know, what would your recommendations be to someone who's going through that process for the first time?
Find someone who knows what they're doing already.
I'd say if you have a story in mind and you want to see if it works as a game, one of the first things I think you should do is don't run it yourself. Give it to a friend, give it to somebody that you trust, who understands your intentions, and have them run it. You want to see how well they interpret all the information that you've given them, how they take all of the nuance and everything, how they run it and how the players experience it. I think if you're running it yourself, it's easy to get excited and involved in everything that's happening. But I also think that there's a lot of shortcuts in your own head that maybe you haven't accounted for in what you're doing.
Yeah, I think writer's bias is something you have to always be looking out for, because you've already thought of all these angles, you've already gone through it, you've already troubleshooted, but there are always going to be things that you miss. And I think, yeah, that's fantastic advice. Hand it to someone else and let them poke holes in it. Yeah.
For video games, I promise you, as someone who did QA for 15 years, your players will not react the way you expect them to. They will not push the button in the right order. They will not follow your rails. They will not pick up your plot hook. They will find the red herring skunk and decide it is their best freaking friend. So that's the kind of thing you need to be able to adapt to.
Your throwaway NPC will become the entire thing.
They have when they were doing Deus Ex, the original Deus Ex, they had this one trap in a corridor where if you went into the corridor, you got cut down by a Gatling gun that was there. And the point was to tell you, don't go for the corridor, loop around and take the windowsill. Players didn't get that. They were like, there's a Gatling gun there, it's not going to get the best of me, I'm going to flush it. Dying consistently. So yeah, you never know how the players are going to take anything you throw at them. You can't take anything for granted.
Yeah, video game, board games. My husband is a huge board game nerd, and he's a competitive. Like I don't play non-cooperative board games because that's not my jam. He and his friends will spend hours just like, how can they rip people apart with Eclipse or I don't know, some of the others. They're all about it, and any loophole you don't think of, someone will.
Yeah, and something super key, this is comes up in board games a lot and RPGs, is that make sure, like obviously writing clarity is very important, and writing organization and how you present those the rules, but make sure to talk with the person that they're interpreting the rule properly. If you've written it well and it's clear, then sometimes I teach English, and I can tell you that reading skills aren't always they vary. And so sometimes I'm like, this is very clear English, but have a conversation with the people who are doing it, because if they're not interpreting the rule properly or the guidelines properly, then you get poor information and it will set you back. How come in this scenario, this scenario is broken, it sucks? Well, you didn't use the thing properly. And so have a conversation, obviously be polite about it, but it's key, because bad information will set you back.
And if you have a story in mind, or you're adapting a book, say, or something like that, and you want to turn it into a game, there's a few things you're going to want to make sure of. First of all, you want to make sure that your player is the hero. You're going to want to make sure that the world is crafted entirely around your player. It can't be that the hero is someone else, and your player is just like a kind of a side character or whatever, or just going along with that. That's going to get boring super quick. No one's going to care about that. They want to be the hero. They want to be the one standing in the gap, fighting off the monsters, just railing on everyone else. If they're just a side character, you will lose them immediately. So craft your entire plot, or craft everything you have around this idea that they are the heroes, and also make sure that they've got something to do in your story. You need to make sure that they have actions that they are taking that are integral to the story that you want to tell. Even if it's just as simple as a few branching narratives or whatever, you have to make it interactive enough to keep people's attention, and they have to be an active participant in your story. So yeah, I think that's.
I think it's true in life too that if you're ever boring at all, ever, you failed. I say I'm a teacher, teaching English. If you're boring, you failed. You're not good at your job. So I think a good blue line for all of life is be interesting. And easier said than done, sure, but yeah.
Yeah, I have a rule in my writing. If I ever stop and think, oh, wouldn't it be terrible if X happened right now?
Do it.
I absolutely have to write that in immediately. I can cut it later, but if I ever think it while I'm writing, it has to go in until I figure out if it's stupid, it breaks the flow or something. So, yes, you don't want to be boring.
I envy a bit of that latitude because I end up by working sometimes, when you're working in video games, you're like, okay, this is who your character is, this is what the journey is about, and things are going to end up by changing. I mean, nothing that you write really kind of survives first contact with your outline, you know? And so the thing is, I'll be saying, okay, so then this happens to the character, and I'll get producers from projects that I will not name going, but I don't get that. You said that they were like this. I'm like, yeah, they start the journey like this. They have to end up over here. You said they're like this. I'm like, okay, let me take you through this slowly. This is about the character arc. But you said they're like this. I was like, oh my God.
So I'm thinking of maybe baby steps, I guess. So one of the magazines I like is, I have an intern there more or less, is the Tales from the Magician's Skull, the Sword and Sorcery magazine. Yes, right. So one reason I like it is one of the few magazines I've seen that it has a bunch of short stories that are sword and sorcery focused, but then they have a section in the end where they go through each of the stories and they statify different elements of the game.
Yeah.
So there's like so for each short story, you get, maybe the stats for the key weapon or monster in there. So you kind of have the choice of living out the short stories afterwards. But I'm curious if the steps you might start to take if you had some fiction to start turning it into a game. For instance, making stats for certain things, or I'm thinking people might not jump into a full game right away, and there might be some baby steps along the way, especially if they don't know what type, where people are at in their journeys. So I'm just trying to think of if you were just given a book and you were told you had to make a video game out of it or something else, how would you start going about?
So the Rogue Academy series of BattleTech has a series of combats in it. And one of the things that I believe Chris Love is doing is he is taking each one of those combat sets and setting it up as a possible fight that you can do in the BattleTech game.
Okay, like a skirmish?
The skirmish, because he was also the person who helped me make sure that the mechs will actually do what I want them to do. Because, again, one head in the clouds, 1 foot on the ground, because you have to respect the players as much as the IP. So to me, you pick active spots. If there's fight sequences, if there's stealth missions, you pick what kind of game you're going to do, and then you figure out where the active spots are and where you can codify it.
Any thoughts on there? Have you been given? I'm not sure when you're tasked with making a video game, what materials you get first, Lucien, but you had to develop something from something. So,
Well, generally, what will happen is it depends on when the writer's usually brought onto the project. If they're brought in at any point that's sort of post-conception, they're kind of locked in a bit to the stuff that they need to do. If they're brought into the conception phase, they'll have a lot more latitude in terms of what they want to introduce. Now, say that we're working with an existing property, well then it'll usually be me that researches the hell out of the existing property and tries to find that nice little wiggle room between something that the community can identify with and hook into, and something that gives us enough leeway to play with it. Because unfortunately, whenever you make that translation over from, let's say, tabletop games or anything like that into video games, it doesn't survive the transition 100% because gameplay has its own restrictions, level design has its own restrictions. And so we have to fiddle around and play around with it. So generally what will happen is we'll have an idea, I will pitch options for what the storyline can be, where it can be set and all of that sort of thing. And it can go through months of iteration before somebody goes, that doesn't work, or yeah, we'll go ahead and move forward with it, or at the last second, and I'm sure you've seen this before, where it's sort of like, yeah, you know, the game we're releasing in 2 months, yeah, we want to redo the storyline because
Actually, that's one of the reasons I got
Okay.
brought online for Shadowrun Returns. And here's the thing about writing dialogue and such for and code triggers, the dialogue triggering code. You're half writing code. You are actually having coding format, XML or something like that, and you have a very short amount of words. When I wrote for Ion, no more than 12 words for a dialogue. And then when you were doing the run to become Master Chef or whatever, you're basically doing fetch quests for 20 times in a row, and we wanted to make those interesting. That the words that you use for the NPCs gave them a personality, but you had 12 words or less.
it's an exercise in writing in Twitter form,
It
basically.
is, and I was actually, when I was hired on to do Ion, the first thing they did was give me a book called The 10% Solution, which is all about writing very economically.
So this is all sounding very cyberpunk to me. I don't work in video games. You're talking about jacking into codes and so I would just say,
You got your typewriter that you.
yeah. I use a typewriter and messenger pigeons or something.
Different mediums.
But it's one of the things I do, like where you're adapting these old short stories, is I go through and I mine it for gamey nuggets. Okay, I go in and I look at for things like Conan. There's a lot to do with lotus. Lotus is this mysterious flower that there's different colors and different types, and they will have different effects on you. And so that's a gamey nugget, right? What happens with this kind of this flower? What does it do? How does that work? Does it slow you down? Do you have to spend more stamina? Does it drive you mad? How do you simulate madness? You know something about that. But it sounds like you guys you've brushed up against some restrictive elements, like you can only use these many words. Thankfully, for what I'm doing, you already have the game engine already works a particular way, but it's a scenario-based game. So then you have mini games within it. So that's when I pull out all those gamey nuggets and I put them to work. And again, that helps capture tone and all those things too.
So say you have a story and you're wanting to convert it into a game. You have to it depends kind of what point you're at. So if you have a story that's completely written, I hate to tell you this, but you're probably going to have to rewrite the whole thing because they are very different mediums in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
They're both words, but they're very different. So you're going to start probably with a basic structure, like an outline or something like that, and you're going to find every point that you can put in, like I was mentioning before, that player interaction. You want to keep stuff as short as you possibly can. Like, I'm not limited to 12 words, so that's great. But I try not to let a segment go over like 300 words or 350 words. And if it goes any longer than that, I know I'm going to have to come back and I'm going to have to break this up because this is getting way too long.
Hold on, are you suggesting that Lovecraft type fiction is verbose? That there's no word limit on those adjectives and adverbs?
Precisely. No. But you do have to keep in mind, you're not writing a novel at this point. You are kind of writing a bunch of short stories. You kind of, I was going to say you're not writing short stories, but that's not true. You kind of are writing a bunch of short stories that the player is playing along with you in. So like our game Dawn of Madness, technically it's like one character is like 200 short stories or something like that. Just little tiny stories with a beginning, actions, often several different kinds of endings, and you're just leading the players along through that process there. So you keep it short and keep your general story in mind, but you're probably going to end up, to a certain degree, starting from scratch. You'll have your basic outline that will remain from the story or from your novel or whatever, but you will have to really form it to the medium that you're moving it into. So hopefully that helps.
Cool. So I have another question or two, but I want to get a rough feel if there's some questions just to start. If there are questions in the audience, can you raise your hand if you're starting to think of questions? We got a couple. All right. So we'll get to them in just a little bit.
It's a good moderator technique. See
Yeah.
how much time we have. And
Well done, Seth. I got a gauge. Well, this might be somewhat repetitive, but maybe should be different. So if we go in reverse, and you're given a game and have to write a story out of it, I thought we'd comment about that. And then, Byron, you actually did this with your game, because I think for one of them, for Deep Madness, I think there was a call from the community that they wanted a book to go with it after the game was made. So I'm curious, maybe just going in reverse, if there's something different in that. Start off with Byron, and we'll work our way down.
Okay, so just making sure. So we've got the game, and now we're doing the book.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, I had a leg up in that I wrote all of Deep Madness, so I kind of knew the world already. But you really have to dig in so deep into the lore, into the world that you're writing for. You need to know every aspect of that place that you have been brought on board to write for. So I once again was very fortunate in the book that I wrote for the Deep Madness universe, in that a lot of it wasn't necessarily as fleshed out, so I got to flesh it all out. But you might not have that. You likely will have a lot more bumpers that you'll have to pay attention to, or you're going to ricochet off of them. Because your fans know everything about this universe, whether you do or not. So they're going to call you out on it if you don't have that information to really form that story. You have to keep in the boundaries of the world, the boundaries of the system, the boundaries of the time frames, and you, even with those constrictions, though, you can still do some really cool, interesting things. So.
Well, it somewhat depends on what you're adapting, because everything I've worked on has been an existing IP. And it's been an existing IP that I've loved. This is my part-time gig, so I'm lucky enough to actually choose projects at this point. And so when I was working on The Terminator, there were a few things you had to look at, because the license on the Nightfall Terminator game only covers the first film. And it also covers the Dark Horse comics from the late 80s, early 90s. And those are awesome. But I decided that it's not a game exists and I'm writing fiction. Wait, is that what we're doing? The game exists, we're writing fiction.
Yeah.
That's what we're talking about.
Yeah.
So, what I wanted to do was tell a Terminator story that would feel like the Terminator, but also do something different. I don't know if you've seen the last 17 Terminator films, but they didn't do things different, and it sucked. Whoa, I didn't say that on record. Actually, because I'm only working on the license for the first episode. And I love the first Terminator, and the first Terminator is very much like a slasher film. And so for me, I was like, if I was a film producer, I would take it back to the slasher roots. And so when it was my job, they said, write a mission, anything about Terminator that you would do. I thought slasher films, it's an 80s movie. Anyways, I thought that why not set it on Halloween? Halloween's very 80s. And so you got a Terminator who's stalking on Halloween, wearing maybe a crazy clown mask with those red eyes underneath. I latched onto certain images and decided to, well, if I was doing a comic script or a film, this is what I would do. And so I injected that into the game. so it stays true to the spirit of the IP, but I think you can do something a little different, but that's not so different, because the Terminator is very much a slasher film. It has to feel like a chase, it has to have the momentum, but be a little risky with the idea, because you do not want it to get stale. And you are not beholden to giant studios who want Terminator 2 again and again and again. So do something else with it, and just make sure you respect the material and you know your stuff.
Before I write fiction for an IP, I have to know why I'm doing it. Because the first thing, when I wrote for Arkham Horror, I wrote Carolyn Fern, the psychologist's origin story, because she was an original character. I had a very technical setup. I had 3 themes. I had character arcs. They had to be approved. It was very much, I was writing a product for them. When I started writing Shadowrun, actually I wrote Battletech Young Adult first. Why I was writing it was to start introducing Battletech to new audience, so that they didn't have to know 37 years worth of IP, and they could enjoy the mechs, and they can enjoy. It's why I went with Young Adult, because I have a several award-nominated Young Adult series that are original. That translated over to Shadowrun, and I have a series of Shadowrun novellas that are young adult. And again, it was designed to bring new people into the IP without worrying about the decades of IP. Now, when I am asked to write just original fiction, the first thing I do is I look for what hasn't been written. I look for the dangling plots. I look for, when Nellis Academy, I actually would use the fact checkers, and I'm like, find me a planet, 2 planets, on one side of a stable border that has been stable for 10 years in this era. And they came up with a planet called Nestor, and it had 1 line of dialogue or description. Wonderful wines come from Nestor. That was it. So I created an entire Nellis Academy. There was Guinan, there was Nellis or Nestor, and I created all of that. And that's one of the best things I love about writing from an established game to prose. I get to invent things. I get to play in people's sandboxes. I get people come up and say, "I played your character." I love that, and I did that with my most recent Shadowrun book. I live in the Seattle area. I got to stat out a whole bunch of Snohomish, where I used to play Ingress. So I got to add in an AR game called Touchstone, based on playing Ingress in Snohomish, because of course there would be AR games in Shadowrun.
Yeah.
So that's what I do.
Sorry, I know I'm going backwards, but there's something you said that I thought was very interesting, where you seek out the dangling plots, or again, it's kind of like the nuggets.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things I thought of for Terminator, and I was like, I don't know if this is, but I tried it out. You know the aesthetic of the Terminator with the ruined wasteland, and there's just skulls. There are so many skulls, there's an unreasonable amount of skulls. It's like everybody was in the street at the same time and just had their skeletons blasted all over the place. And I thought, obviously that's a cool aesthetic choice, right? But what if there's something more there? And so one of the tiny throwaway plot hooks that I put in there was, what's with all these bones, man? What's with all these skulls? And it was like, perhaps the machines are deciding to do a little more psychological warfare. So they actually collect all these skeletons, and they have like a bone spitter. So something that goes around and just litters the landscape with all these bones to mess with the resistance troopers. And seeking out those little nuggets, it's immensely satisfying to yourself, because you're like, hey, that's a cool idea. And oftentimes the fans will be, hey, that is a cool idea. Or they'll be, hey, don't mess with canon, it's stupid.
The other thing I love about this is I get to write canon fiction. What I put down is real. Elfin Black, people are now taking the plot line from the Snohomish Club and turning it into role-playing games. For Makeda Red, it started on a party train. They created a mission for you to do a run on this non-24-hour party train that doesn't stop. Well, unless it crashes, which, you know, spoiler alert, it does in my book. But that's just the first part of it.
Any quick comments, Lucien, or like some comments from Byron after that?
Yeah, not a problem. No, all I was going to say is the one time that I had the privilege of doing the reverse, or at least trying to audition for the reverse, was during Far Cry 3 and Far Cry 4. We were working with a publication company, and I was sort of pitching novel ideas to them. And so it was, the advantage that I had was that I would be able to realize not so much the characters better, because the characters were almost silent in some ways, the main characters. The better developed personalities were the villains and the level design and the environment. So it would be much more of an ability to explore in that way. So it gave me a lot more of an opportunity to explore something that not a lot of novelists would have had the opportunity being embedded inside the team.
So we got 10-ish minutes left, so I'll try to get these questions. Try to make it quick if you can, because that's, you were earlier, not the by the way.
So if one has love of making virtual worlds or a lot of creative environments with detail, but does not have strong game mechanics or plot lines in mind, what medium would be the best way of expressing these environments and settings? So which mediums, stories, fiction games, board games, tabletop, video, what the best way would be to express an environment or a world to get audience engaged with?
Yeah, but you can make
So if I'm understanding your question correctly, I think what you need to do is don't worry about the medium. Focus on what is your natural storytelling methodology, first of all, and have it grow from there, okay? Like, in terms of the stories that you enjoy doing, are you talking about you're trying to figure out how to tell those stories, or you've already fictionalized it and you're trying to see how it translates over?
It's more than I've already imagined in a setting, environment, really detailed, but I don't know what plot itself. It would be more very naturalistic rather than a specific this, then this, then this. And I don't have any strong game mechanics in mind to make a game out of it. I just have the world.
Maybe choose an existing system
Yeah.
that is a little more rules light, because then you won't be completely overwhelmed with having to figure out the system in square peg round hole. You've just got something that's a little more open, and then play around with that.
Yeah, Lori Preby wrote a super fast one-shot, a 2d6 one-shot mechanic that's on Drive-Thru RPG right now, that you can literally create a character in like 5 minutes and be playing in whatever environment you have set up.
Sounds like you need an existing sandbox to get and play around with it a little bit. Let's take another one. Over here.
Thank you for doing this panel. It's really awesome. So when I think of the being able to write canon fiction, the absolute antithesis to that would be like Bethesda or BioWare. You can make a character that can just do anything. Any token you want. It's great. It's really agentic, but it also, I think, creates a lot of ludonarrative dissonance. And so, because you can do anything, suddenly the character just does whatever. So when you want to turn that into a story, and you want to write about a protagonist in that realm, like, what do? Do you write the canon Dovahkiin, or is you just step away from that and do something totally different in that realm?
It's an interesting question. I think for myself, I've probably talked to the property owner and trying to figure out what it is that they want to showcase in that world. That would be your first step, and I'll leave the other steps to...
The reason I wrote Doc Wagon 19, which was basically a TV tabloid reporter doing a ride-along on a high-threat response medical team. From her point of view, was to do a tour of the Sixth World. You don't do Dovahkiin as the story. You do the sidekick who has their own hero journey, because unless you are hired to do a metadata overall arcing, you're moving the story forward.
Yeah, one of the things, I guess, I think this kind of answers it too, is like, if you've got a character like Conan who is the ultimate badass, no one's beating Conan. His whole superpower is he doesn't lose. He might get close to it, but he doesn't. I don't know if you want to compete with that, right? I think you want to have him sort of in the background, and it's Conan's world and everyone else is living in it. And if it's an IP so tied to the main character, yeah, don't try to don't try to step on those feet, I guess, right? Tell something tonally on base, and then maybe have him sort of on the outskirts. Or
Conan needs you to do something.
yes, exactly. Like
He is depending on you.
yeah, the Age of Conan board game video game did that quite well, where you're living in that world and you might go on missions for him. And I think personally too, when I play those games, I don't necessarily want to be Conan. I want to kind of be adjacent to Conan, because that's cool.
I was going to say though that with Bethesda, you're going to end up by playing in Dovahkiin an archer with stealth anyways.
Yeah.
All paths lead there, so you know.
Okay, we don't have too much time. You got a question?
Okay, so how do you quarantine problematic mechanics? So for example, every time I read like a World of Warcraft novel, I'm like, oh no, they killed somebody, but let's find a level 12 priest to resurrect them. Not an issue. Or something like a time turn. Or some like broken magical effect that kind of takes away some of the stakes from what you're trying to communicate.
Yeah.
Well, we're out of time.
If I can avoid addressing that altogether, I do. I tell the story I want to tell, and if I don't have to be like, oh, line of sight teleportation, this is how we, get the ring in Mordor because I can see Mordor, therefore I can teleport there. I don't address it. I stay away from it because you won't make anybody happy. You won't make your publisher happy. You won't make the fans happy, and you will go everywhere trying to get things right.
Yeah. Good answer.
Or you allow the villain to be the rule breaker. The one that the spell that you use prevents resurrection.
Or there's a special kind of special or something.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
But it is tricky because again, game mechanics have their own function and everything, and there is a certain leeway that you should allow yourself, and that the publisher and the IP holder should understand that we're going to deviate or mess around a little bit because we can't be 100% accurate sometimes to the content. And it's unfortunate, but it's the reality sometimes.
And sometimes the IP holder says, no, you can't do that.
Yep.
So we don't have too much time, but we'll give a quick blitz of if you have any final comments, like 40 seconds worth-ish. Now's a good time. I don't know, Lucien, do you have any closing comments? Or?
No, not really. The thing is, the only thing that I'm going to say is that whatever we write, we always write with the community in mind, with the people that we're writing to in mind, because we know that you will always be the people that know more about our property sometimes than we do.
Yeah.
So whatever we do, it comes from a place of respect, as much as we sometimes need to change things.
I am downstairs in Authors Avenue at about the 1,000th level. If you'd like to read any of my Shadowrun, my Battletech, or my Arkham Horror, I have it with me. Thank you, come down.
If you like sword and sorcery, listen to the Rogues in the House podcast. And if you like to read sword and sorcery, the Rogues in the House podcast put out a book called A Book of Blades. It's really good. I mean, I have a story in there. He has a story in there. Those stories are good, but we also have we got some giants in there, like Howard Andrew Jones and John Fultz. Just really contemporary, good, dare I say, inclusive sword and sorcery stories. Check it out. It's on Amazon, A Book of Blades. And I have copies too. You can see me.
Be sure you're having fun. Have fun with what you're doing. If you do not enjoy it, you're in the wrong profession. Be sure as you're moving through this process that you're having fun, because if you're not, your players are not going to have fun. They are going to just they're going to see through it, and it's just going to fall to pieces. So
Hashtag don't be boring.
right. Hashtag don't be boring.
Awesome. Well, thanks. Actually, when we proposed this type of panel, it was so, I don't know, interesting to the authors, we actually made a duplicate of it. I forget the timing of it, but there's one with the same name with a different set
Okay.
of panelists.
I was panicking there for a
Oh,
second.
yeah, I meant to mention that at the beginning. We didn't do that to mess with you. I think the idea is we proposed that, and so many authors wanted to be on it, we decided we'll make two. Though I'm being amiss here, I don't actually remember the timing of it, but there's another one soon.
It's almost like we're at a gaming convention.
Yeah, something like that. But
It's more like an hour after this one started.
okay, awesome. Okay,
Tomorrow
cool.
at 3?
Yeah.
Tomorrow, thank you very much. You rock. So let's thank everybody.
Where am I headed to now?
That was when I was prepared for because I didn't know anything about it. I was just trying to learn it. The others, like, there was like these shit other questions. This one I got, I don't know. All right, let's just. I got the introduction after that. I don't know.
Thanks for the, it was fun sharing the panel with you.
Yes, sir. Likewise. No, it was fantastic. Really good
Thanks so
answers.
much, Lucien. It's great to meet you. It's great to meet you as well. I'm actually still in this room, so I'm just going to park my house and just relax.
Yeah, I guess this is all the.
Be kind to yourself, sir.
Thank you for that. 'Cause,
Yeah, you got